Recording. And so we can start now. So I am Sarah, and I'm the executive director of the Saskatchewan Weightlifting Association. And today we have Samantha Heron, and she is with ITP, and she's going to do a little bit of a presentation to everyone just about, I guess, the importance of safe sport and how everything works because we have moved into more of the third-party reporting system now. And so it's a fairly similar new program for us. So Samantha here can run us through everything, I guess.
Thanks so much. Nice to be here with you all. I will get my screen sharing sorted. So we've got a small group tonight, but where I typically start with some housekeeping is given that this session is recorded and hopefully shared to those who couldn't attend this evening, I have a couple of asks. One of them is that we will hold off on any questions until the end of the presentation, if there are any, so that we are able to have a consistent flow for individuals who may watch this recording in future. As well, from time to time, people may want to ask questions about a specific dispute that they've been a part of, or perhaps even a specific complaint proceeding that they've been a part of. What I kindly ask is that if you are to ask a question, you generalize the information as much as possible. We don't want to inadvertently share information that is expected to be kept confidential or that somebody may not want on a shared and public recording. Beyond that, I will begin. As mentioned, my name is Samantha. I'm the Chief Complaints Officer for ITP Sport. ITP Sport is a complaint management service that works with many different sport organizations across Canada and sometimes even into the US. And our role is to support the administration of discipline and complaint mechanisms. We are neutrals in the process, so we are not, unlike the arbitrators and investigators that we work with, decision makers over any cases. And I have a background in conflict management, and so part of what we'll be spending time on this evening is also talking about some ways that we can access alternative dispute resolution, as it can often be a really helpful tool when we are dealing with some less escalated conflicts or disputes. So, without further ado, what's the hope for the session today? We want to be able to differentiate between when something is conflict and when something is considered a violation of the SWA Code of Conduct. We want to be able to identify when is it appropriate to escalate and when should we consider some alternative ways to de-escalate ahead of something becoming more conflictual or more challenging to navigate through. We will also spend some time talking about the complaint mechanism that is available via Sask Sport and SWA using us and some of the other providers in Saskatchewan, and then talk through some tools to resolve internally. In speaking with SWA and reflecting on the sport system writ large, we see a couple of consistent themes coming up. One of them is, well, especially when we notify somebody of a complaint or they're made aware of while we're actually engaging in a formal process, is oftentimes people will say, well, why did nobody give me a phone call? Or how come nobody let me know that this was a concern earlier on? Similarly, we see concerns around all types of disputes turning into a complaint, and that often lends itself to not understanding or having a lack of clarity on safe sport just being about abuse as we classically know it. And so the intention this evening is to be really clear on when are we actually needing to escalate and for what reasons. And there's some really valid and justifiable reasons for why individuals may not be able to simply resolve a dispute with a call amongst themselves. Similarly, we also hope to have an understanding that the scope of what both safe sport and the SWA policies address are actually just much larger than those classic definitions of abuse or discrimination that we may be familiar with. We use the word safe sport often as a blanket term to describe the work of independent third parties or about navigating a complaint process, but complaint processes or dispute resolution mechanisms are actually designed to address many different types of disputes that occur within the sport environment, even if they aren't meeting what can be often a narrow definition of prohibited behavior or maltreatment which abuse falls underneath that umbrella, as an example. So, where I'll start this evening is, well, what actually is a formal complaint mechanism and why does it exist? So, unlike that phone call that we talked about where everybody can hop on a call or meet for a coffee and talk it out in order to we come to some sort of resolution, when we enter a formal complaint process, what we are doing is engaging in a disciplined process that must follow, in this case, the SWSA policies and procedures, sorry, the SWA policies and procedures. And the point of this is to provide a consistent and repeatable process that will address any formal complaint that meets the threshold to proceed. The fundamentals of any dispute resolution process is that it's procedurally fair. And what that means is that both parties to the dispute, or however many parties are engaged in the dispute, will have the opportunity to understand all of the information relied upon ahead of the decision maker coming to a decision. Because the process must follow a set procedure, it allows the scope of the dispute to be maintained. It ensures that there are independent administrators available to make sure that the parties are being communicated with in a way that is respectful and clear and informative about what the process is. What's also important is that we create a written record for which the complaint or dispute is relied upon. And what I mean by that is the record is all of the information that will be submitted as part of a complaint process. And it's preserved for a period of time so that if we need to understand how a decision came to be, or if we need to understand, well, what information was actually relied upon at this time, we can rely on the written record. A huge reason why sport organizations are working with independent third parties is because for very, I guess for a long time or prior to independent third party mechanisms coming into play, often the decision making was left to individuals who may be in leadership roles or who were simply there in the moment and were that first point of contact to respond. And I used to work in the sports system as an employee or as a staff person. I've also been a volunteer in the sports system and I've served on boards in the sports system. And I am absolutely aware of the tax on individuals who are volunteering or whose job description includes many, many more items than actually navigating and responding to complaints and disputes. And so by having access to the formal process, we ideally reduce the tax that is on the sport organizations in navigating through or working through the disputes by providing this resource and service. And importantly, in going through any sort of formal complaint mechanisms, the decision makers must not be in a conflict of interest. This removes both the appearance or any actual bias that can be present when we are trying to resolve disputes locally. By having a clearly defined process, we're able to explain to people what to expect, and individuals can understand the rationale for why matters may or may not be accepted. And that leaves people from feeling singled out or that they may be of the position that somebody is just out to get them, when that's not the case, because an independent and unconflicted decision maker is reviewing the information. And I'll go back to a few slides ago where we had that question about, isn't safe sport just about abuse? Um, that's often where many of the focusing events occurred in sport, as you may have been aware of in the media over the past few years, or that you may have heard of or experienced directly in your sport. Um, what's happened and the reason why we have both these codes of conduct and safe sport policies in place is that there were norms in the sport environment that often went unchecked that resulted in maltreatment, and that might be psychological maltreatment, including harassment and discrimination. Perhaps it is online social media attacks. It may be grooming behavior or sexual maltreatment. It may also be organizations or boards feeling intimidated or receiving undue pressure from member organizations within their ecosystem. But Beyond that, when we consider the SWA Code of Conduct, and trust me, I'm not going to run through it tonight. And if you're ever wanting to read a policy, I never motivate people to do that, but I do think it's important to familiarize yourself with what are the language and key themes of these codes of conduct. You'll notice that a lot of the themes there are focused on sport leadership, ethical conduct, promoting the sport in the best way possible, ensuring transparency and clear communication. And so the conduct standards that we have in place and the conduct standards that we must adhere to are much broader than simply addressing maltreatment, and they exist to support and uphold a positive, healthy, and respectful sport environment. And so I've touched on a couple of these key areas. Um, Beyond those typical items around maltreatment or what I would call egregious misconduct, oftentimes many of the types of complaints we're seeing are related to confidentiality concerns, breaches of the fiduciary responsibilities of an organization. A huge one that we're seeing more often is social media misconduct or social media mismanagement. We often think that, well, just because I'm going to use the example of rowing that used to be my sport, just because I've left the boathouse, all of a sudden the code no longer applies. Well, that's not always the case. When you are communicating on public forums or forums where individuals can clearly connect that it is you who is communicating, you are still subject to both a social media policy and a code of conduct if that conduct could harm the organization, individuals involved in the sport, or somehow bring yourself into disrepute as it relates to your relationship with the sport. This is especially important when we are helping our minors understand how to use social media or helping the youth in our spaces use social media. Oftentimes, we see after a competition, individuals may be interacting on Snapchat or on Instagram, and they don't realize the magnitude of what they're saying. And when that quick Snapchat is captured in a screenshot, and what was said was actually really concerning to the person who's heard it on the other side, we often in those situations will see those matters escalated to a formal complaint process. And more often than not, that respondent said, you know what, I didn't actually intend to cause harm. I didn't think that that was going to happen here. But it's really important that we have an awareness that our social media actions and what we post publicly, even if it's not happening directly in the sport environment, can be connected to breaches of our code and really align with values that we expect in sport today. So I've spent some time on, well, what actually is written in this code of conduct? What is it all about? How do we know when we have conflict versus a code of conduct violation? This is probably one of the most challenging decisions that we have to make as people who do intakes for complaints. Um, Most of the time, when somebody is submitting a formal complaint, it's because they are experiencing conflict or they are having something happen to them that feels really uncomfortable and may make it challenging to be in the sport environment. That being said, not all conflict constitutes a breach of the code of conduct or meets what are quite specific definitions or language in the code of types of behaviors that would constitute a breach. So, um, and not this board from what I know, but I've seen many boards across sport organizations that have very strong and differing opinions about how an organization should run or what should the operational directives or decisions look like. And if a board iterates over that over and over and over again and continues to clash and not be able to actually come to an agreement on how to move forward, that's a really good example of where we see this disagreement causing people to throw up their hands and say, I don't want to be a part of this anymore. I can't engage with this anymore. Or really just have a strong difference of opinions on how to proceed. Um, and while we often see those types of conflict, very rarely does the behavior that happened in that conflict, even though it was apparent that there was a disagreement, does that behavior constitute a violation of a code. Um, We often also see miscommunication or concerns as it relates to team selection decisions, or comments made by coaches to an athlete to an athlete, where how it was perceived was very different from how it was intended, or in the way that it was delivered really led to a lack of understanding of what the intent of that communication was. And so on the other side of that, we'll see often hurt feelings of not being welcome in the environment. And it's really important at the time of looking at that dispute that we're able to parse through where is that behavior actually violating the code and where is it clearly just staying in that conflict space. A really good example is when we think about harassment. Harassment is often described as a pattern of unwanted behavior. There can be a single incident, but individuals may have a conflict and go back and forth and back and forth. And then where it would escalate into harassment is if one party to that conflict says, you know what, hey, I need a break. I need 2 days before I'm coming back to this conversation. And the other person continues calling and emailing and saying, hey, I want to talk about this. Well, if that person said, hey, I need some space, and then maybe after the second phone call, they said, please don't contact me anymore, and somebody keeps communicating after they've been expressly told to take a pause, that is when we can see behavior moving into that space of harassment, even though it just started as a conflict. So, if you are somebody who is understanding or looking at a formal complaint, when you're looking at what we call the allegations or the information submitted as part of a complaint, you go, if this were found to be true, and what that means by that, if it's found to have merit or if it's substantiated, meaning that there's enough supporting information, an objective decision maker could say, yes, I think that this happened in the way that it's being presented. If that's found to be true, then the behavior would constitute or could constitute a breach of the code of conduct, and that's when conflict becomes a breach. If you're looking at this and going, if everything that's presented to me here is found to be true, it's still not meeting any of this language in the code, then it's not likely to be something that would be admitted as part of a formal complaint process. So we've talked a little bit about conflict escalating to a breach of a code. You may be somebody who is one day experiencing conflict and trying to understand, when do I need more support here, or when do I need to engage a neutral and independent third party? How do I know when it's actually escalated? The most obvious one is often when there is clear harm. The physical maltreatment is the easiest example of this. If somebody is assaulted, pushed, shoved, injured in that setting, clearly we would all agree that harm has occurred. When harm's occurred, that's often your first indicator that you should be escalating. Similarly, if individuals are feeling intimidated, like if they were to make a decision that somehow disagrees with the person who's intimidating or disagreeing with them, that there may be retaliation or repercussions, that's also when an independent decision maker should be involved. Um, Dependent on the severity of the conflict, if the issue or conflict repeats itself or continues occurring even after you instructed somebody to stop, that's when we're starting to look at, this is definitely an escalated situation. Maybe we tried to resolve and it didn't happen. And that would be a really appropriate time to escalate. Um, we also will often find things to be a violation of the code when it clearly affects multiple members. A social media post may be a really good example of this. If something is discriminatory on social media and many members who identify with whatever that ground for discrimination may be are viewing this post, many individuals may feel targeted or uncomfortable returning to the environment. That's another clear indicator that this is extending beyond just two individuals in a disagreement, and this conduct actually adversely affects many people in the environment. And then lastly, we think about, is there an abuse of authority here? Is somebody in a position of power making decisions that somehow negatively impact others? Um, and is there a significant or real safety concern. That may be physical safety, it may be psychological safety. But if there's a concern of if I return to the environment tomorrow, I may experience more harm, that's definitely an indicator that something should be escalated. And so I often start with these types of questions. Is there a power imbalance? Has it happened before? Has anybody tried to resolve informally? If we're saying no to most of those questions, we would start with some options for internal or informal conflict resolution. If most answers are yes, even if one or two answers are yes, then that's what we would consider escalating to a formal complaint process. So why not just a phone call? Um, A phone call may work sometimes. There are times where I've even seen a formal complaint process engaged and then the respondent is notified, and then 2 days later, everybody calls me and says, you know what, hey, we actually had a really good conversation on the sidelines. We've agreed to this, this, and that. And therefore, we're good. We're not going to move down this formal process anymore. I've seen this be the most successful when there isn't a power imbalance between the parties involved, when it's more likely than not that there isn't going to be a policy breach or that that policy breach is not significant. Um, when when this works is also when both parties are really interested in trying to resolve. Sometimes I have people come forward that I would call a reluctant complainant. They're saying, I just don't really know what to do. I haven't had access to much information on how I can resolve. What I just really want is for things to go back to normal in this space with this other person. Um, but I wasn't sure how to approach it. Those situations are the ones where our radar goes up and we can go, yeah, hey, informal resolution may actually be a really good fit here. And I'm going to talk about some other options beyond just a phone call in a few slides. Um, where there's a significant power imbalance, where we see vulnerable participants involved, so that's being typically minors, perhaps an individual with a disability involved, where this person may be vulnerable, where there is a clear or easy way for somebody to be retaliated against, um, then we would never want to encourage or suggest that somebody try and resolve informally without support. Um, the reasons why these processes exist is to provide some scope, barriers, and also sometimes often just a medium for communication between individuals that makes it much easier to address the dispute than if individuals were speaking face to face or on their own without the support of a neutral in that conversation. And so before we talk about some conflict resolution pieces, I think it's helpful to work through a few examples. Now, these obviously are perhaps examples from complaints that we've had, and you do not have access to the full details here. So you can probably see how it's hard to understand where it might go. First example that we often see is, a coach publicly criticizing a board member on Facebook. They're really upset with a recent decision. These often are matters that would escalate as a code of conduct and a violation of the social media policy, depending on what that criticism looks like. Now, if somebody posts something where it's clearly not identifying the organization, it's not disparaging anyway, maybe you're saying, I had a really frustrating today in my day in my sport. Well, no, that's not seen as public criticism. But where somebody is specifically targeting, mentioning, referencing somebody else online, that's the type of behavior that would get escalated. Um, Sometimes we have clubs disagreeing with perhaps a provincial sport organization's selection criteria. While this can feel frustrating and an organization may go, we can't understand why that's what their view is on how selection should be done. This is often not the type of behavior or decision that we would see being subject to any sort of complaint process. We're disagreeing with a decision, but that doesn't mean that this organization's selection criteria has somehow breached or brought the organization into disrepute. Then we go to a volunteer feels excluded from decision making. when you look at situations like this, you have to ask yourself the question of, are they being discriminated against for a certain reason? Is somebody misusing or inappropriately exercising their power over this individual? Or is it just simply the case that how this is operating, volunteers aren't actually involved in decision making? And even though this person may feel excluded, what may actually need to happen here is that there's an expectation management done around when volunteers are or are not engaged. And then, you look at the last example here, an athlete alleges repeated intimidation. This is a type of situation where you want to ask more questions. Who's doing the intimidating? When and how is it happening? And what does it actually look like? We often use strong words when we're in conflict around how we're feeling. And so we need to be able to actually identify, is somebody using strong language, or is it true that they are experiencing intimidation and it's actually happening? So if we do identify that something's ripe for conflict resolution, we've talked a lot about the phone call so far today, but one of my favorite tools is to work with or bring in a mediator or a neutral. Um, in mediation, the decision making still remains with the parties in a dispute. They are ultimately the ones who decide on what the outcome is. The job of the mediator is to perhaps suggest outcomes or options that we may not have thought of. They are able to, in a neutral way, say, "Hey, I think this is realistic, and I don't think that's actually that realistic for this situation." Um, and they're able to help communicate things in a different way that the parties may not actually be able to, because that conflict is really getting in the way of clear communication. And so for the majority of the complaints that we see, I do think that there's a strong opportunity to resolve through mediation. And you can also bring in a mediator before a formal process is engaged, because those mediators are able to be really creative, and the scope of what you can address is often much broader than what is actually at issue in that formal complaint. Um, One of the other tools that's often helpful across organizations, and I know that there's some board members on the call this evening, so I don't want to put more work on anybody's laps. But having a board come in and explain, how the organizations or how the member organizations can best operate within a sport, or what those available supports can look like, can often be a really helpful tool when a club is experiencing a dispute. For a club to be able to turn to leadership within the sport environment, we find that to be really, really helpful for supporting alignment and for clarifying, yeah, what are the values that are and are not supported in these sport environments. Um, and then where we always start when we're not in front of that formal complaint process is to start from a place of assuming good intent. I have two stepkids in my life, and they can argue over anything that is in front of them, whether it's a piece of dust on the floor or whether it's arguing about something they see in the news, and everything in between. And they will get into these huge, big conflicts, and we often have to bring them back to, what are we trying to achieve here? And do you agree that you want to be good siblings with each other or good partners in this household? And most of the time they come around and say, yeah, 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 that's actually what's important to me. Um, when we can come back to the fact that we're assuming that most people have good intent, or that their intention was not meant to be harmful, then we can often start from a place of working together. Once we can understand that the intent was not harmful, there's still an opportunity to clarify that the impact may have been harmful. And that gives individuals an opportunity to go, whoa, I had no idea how I was coming across in this conversation or in this dynamic. I can definitely see your side of the story. I'm really open to adjusting my behavior moving forward. And we all know that after a conflict, it may feel a little bit awkward and clunky as you return to that environment. But as you are navigating and really trying to come to a resolution, with the understanding that the other side has good intent, it becomes much easier to build trust. Um, and part of that is really focusing on what's the behavior. And maybe you've heard this if you've ever been in a relationship and you're looking at your partner and you go, "Oh my God, I can't believe that they're going to load the dishwasher that way one more time." Um, it's their behavior that's the issue, not who they are at their core or who they are as a person. Because if you're choosing to remain in that relationship, if you're choosing to continue engaging with that person, it's likely the case that you find that their character is good. And so instead of using the language like you always do this, or you should never do that, if we can bring it back to, hey, how this happened or how you communicated X, Y, and Z was really concerning for me when we were at this competition on the weekend. Would you be open to communicating it in a different way moving forward? I know that you didn't mean to cause any conflict. Now, all of that being said, if we do still have some mistrust of the behavior not stopping, one of the things that I always encourage is documenting what's happened should the behavior escalate. I don't mean bringing out your phone and recording every meeting, but I do mean making a note of, hey, on March 10th, I asked so and so to stop communicating this way after a board meeting. And they actually failed to do that on March 15th. We had another disagreement. And on March 20th, here's the email that I got that once again felt like it was really, attacking the organization or what have you. Maintaining a record, should you need to escalate down the road, um, is really helpful for having a clear and coherent picture of what's happened to be able to demonstrate how something has escalated. So, we've tried doing everything we can to resolve this dispute. So far, we haven't been successful, and now we're filing a formal complaint. So that's where an organization like ourselves would come in, or you may be familiar with an organization in Saskatchewan called ADR Sask. When a formal complaint is filed, the decision making is taken out of the hands of the complainant and respondent, and the ITP is responsible for deciding on if the complaint is accepted or not. And should the complaint be accepted, then unless the parties are resolving through mediation, it is the responsibility of an independent neutral, who is typically somebody with experience in safe sport related matters or a legal profession, to decide on what the outcome is. Everybody involved should have peace of mind that there's nobody, internal to the organization who may have a bias or a preference who is deciding on that complaint. Everybody participating must disclose that they have no conflict of interest. And so this really serves to preserve the integrity of the process and minimizes the opportunity to escalate down the road and to say, hey, this decision making was done by somebody biased when it clearly was not. Um, in a formal complaint process, I really don't like to compare these things to what you think of when you see Law and Order on TV, but sometimes it can be helpful for a basic example. Um, in a complaint process, the arbitrator or that discipline panel, they do function in a similar way to how a judge would function. They are tasked with deciding, and then ultimately they do have the ability to make a decision on the case or to issue a quote unquote ruling. That decision then must be recognized by the organization and upheld by the organization. But in a formal complaint process, both parties have the opportunity to be heard. This is especially important for anybody who is named as a respondent. It's often my experience that when we notify someone who is a respondent to a complaint that a complaint's been accepted, they go, whoa, 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 when was my opportunity to respond? The purpose of going through this process is to create an opportunity to respond and to allow both parties to be able to share information to that decision maker ahead of deciding on an outcome. Of course, if mediation is attempted, then the formal complaint pathway would not continue because the parties would come to a good faith resolution with the expectation that everyone adheres to that resolution moving forward. most importantly in these processes is that we have procedural fairness. One of the things that's often challenging is we're not actually often able to proceed with anonymous complaints because in order to anonymize or redact information so much so that the respondent can't understand who filed the complaint means that the respondent would not actually be able to understand the details or the specifics of the complaint. And so, while it can absolutely be I'm going to call it an escalating or um, challenging situation to be in as a complainant where you have to present your allegations forward, it is important, if you can imagine, if you were ever in the shoes as a respondent, that you actually know what the allegations are against you so that you can respond appropriately to them. Um, once is advocated or activated, sorry, people will understand what the timelines are typically. Um, you will also understand and be aware of who the decision makers are. So it's not like the discipline panel is hiding behind a screen and you don't know what their names are. You'll have an opportunity to understand who is actually the person who is deciding over this case. Um, and and the decisions are made on a standard that's called a balance of probabilities. Unlike criminal proceedings where decisions are made on beyond a reasonable doubt standards, on balance of probabilities, it means after I've reviewed all of the evidence and all of the information available, do I think that it is more likely than not that this behavior occurred? If yes, then you would find that that complaint is substantiated or is deemed to have merit. Following any sort of discipline proceeding, alongside the information submitted as part of the process, there should be a written decision issued. And this helps explain oftentimes the rationale for how a decision was reached, the information relied upon in order to come to that decision. And then, because the organization has access to that information, the organization can then reflect and review and go, is there anything that we need to communicate or do differently for our membership to avoid situations like these happening in future, or to support participants in understanding this is why certain behavior is or is not a violation of the code. What we often find is sometimes matters get escalated to us after, let's say, a club tried to escalate it internally or what have you. Or people will say, well, we just removed that person after we had a concern with them. Challenge is that because that behavior went undocumented or unaddressed, it means that there isn't a formal record to rely upon to understand what actually was the concern here and how it was addressed. And so that's why when behavior does escalate, it's really, really important that we do engage in processes like these so that we can have a history of what's happened and so that we can look back in time and go, yep, we actually have flagged this concern. And here's why perhaps a more severe sanction is appropriate because we see that this has happened in the past. Okay, I've just downloaded a lot of information for the session so far tonight, so we're getting close to the end here. Um, Some of the key takeaways that I always say is conflict is normal. We recognize that people in sport are competitive. Sport is hugely important to who we are. Perhaps it's important to our identity. I was a former athlete. I know how much time and energy is invested into participating. And so that's why I know that this can often be an emotional experience. That does not mean that our behavior should escalate beyond what is considered appropriate for the field of play or for what we can expect as part of a respectful environment. Um, it can feel scary and intimidating and challenging to participate in a complaint process, but in my opinion, they exist to allow for fairness, to allow for neutrals to help administrate the process. We do know that it's challenging, but at the same time, we hope that by participating in processes such as these, that people can feel that they had access to natural justice and procedural fairness as they went through a process. Um, and then what I hope I can leave with anybody who watches this and those attending this evening is that where it feels comfortable to do so, try and de-escalate and try and resolve informally. Whenever it starts tipping over into that space of It's not feeling like I can actually comfortably and safely return to the environment if I were to address this myself, or I tried to and it actually got worse. That's when we should absolutely be escalating. And if significant harm is apparent and present at the beginning, then there's no need to try and resolve informally when you can seek support on the other side. And so that brings me to an opportunity for questions at this time. I know that there is a smaller group tonight. What I would ask is that if there are questions, we'll probably not share the recorded questions, just the content of the session.